Hello and welcome to the Privacy Corner with me, Robert Bateman, and Vaibhav Antil, who is CEO of Privado AI. Each week, same time, same day, every week here on LinkedIn, we'll be looking at the weekly news, going a bit deeper, looking at the trends and themes emerging from law and enforcement and technology in the worlds of privacy and data protection. And we'll also have a deep dive each week on one main item. And this week we're talking about privacy in health apps and health websites, health related services in general online, because there's so much interesting stuff happening in that area on both sides of the Atlantic, just for a start. So Vaibhav, good to be here with you. How are you this week? How are things going over at Bravado AI?
Hey Rob, I'm good. Excited to be here with you again and to chat with the audience on LinkedIn, privacy professionals, and hear from them and share, our learnings on all the updates which are happening this week. I would say like privacy is kind of like a very exciting time, right? There are too many. There is a regulatory development which is happening on the health side, which we will discuss today. But the overall trend from our vantage point, I can see is regulators are getting more savvy. I mean, if we'll talk about the FTC case, but it's talking about a specific some SDKs in the mobile app, which is as technical as you could get, right? Uh, so yeah, regulators are getting savvier and moving towards code. And on the other side, there is this new technology, which is, or I would say, like even like a platform shift that we are seeing of moving with AI and these large language models. So I think, yeah, it's an unprecedented pace on both the technology side of the things and also on the regulatory savviness. So pretty exciting week for sure.
Good. Yes, it seems like regulators are getting more to grips with how technology is impacting privacy, how so many companies are. Well, look, we'll get into this in our main item, of course, but quite routine data sharing sort of practices that have been quite commonplace for many years are now coming under more scrutiny. Now, I generally come from a more regulatory sort of standpoint, and Vaibhav, you're more of a technical expert, so we can meet in the middle, I hope. And just to mention as well, there's a newsletter to go with this. We're going to cover some of the stuff in the newsletter here, but I had to really pick and choose this week because there's so much going on. So there's a bit more in the newsletter if you'd like to sign up to that. So let's do a quick roundup of news items then.
Yeah.
I'd like to start with this relatively, well, it hasn't been massively talked about. Meta is in court, not unusual. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp owner Meta. And they have a fairly good point, I think, in their defense of a class action claim against them. So basically, the deal is they are being taken to court for receiving data and facilitating the sharing of data via the Meta Pixel, this
Yeah.
ubiquitous tracking tool that's all over the internet. And the the allegation is that Meta is liable for healthcare websites using Pixel to share personal data with Meta. Now, Meta says we're not responsible for how people use our tools. We put them out there. We've got terms and conditions that say you must do certain things. And if people don't comply with those terms and conditions, then that's their fault. Now, Meta, of course, has not the strongest track record on privacy, but I think there is a point here that the tools themselves might be problematic, but primarily this case is about how people are using them, which is not getting consent, using them in the wrong contexts, sending sensitive data. What do you think about this, Vaibhav? Do you think that Meta has a point?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point because, I mean, as we looked as well, the pixel breach was kind of as it came to be known in the US at least, kind of the biggest one, website after or health hospital after hospital or a health operator after health operator was notifying the regulator about this pixel breach. And so yeah, it's very common practice, or this thing became this kind of health sharing became common practice accidentally, or someone actually doing it. So I mean, I'm not surprised this has gone there. But to your point, I do feel while you can debate the if cookies and pixels should be there in the first place or not, and then companies like platforms like Android or Google, or at least sorry, Apple or Google are making efforts to force consent, and then we do have e-privacy to also have a consent requirement. From a company perspective, right, it's like any other tool, right? For example, if you use Slack, I could put, or email, right? You remember like the earliest ways people would send or breach data is just send like personal information over email, right? In that case, I'm sure like a Outlook or a Gmail is not responsible because you send an Excel sheet with tons of credit card numbers or social security number, because you were not supposed to share it on mail and not supposed to share it outside your company or however, right? So I would agree to your point that already on the pixel and cookie side there is clear regulation. So from a privacy standpoint, using that or not using that is a risk that business has taken. Uh, and the final call of how it gets implemented is also in the hands of the business, right? So Meta, I mean, as a company or any other company can facilitate, make it easier, have the defaults better. But in the case that we are seeing, these pixels are taking like things like form information, screen names, page URLs, and that itself is leaking health data, right? Because if you're using a mental health app and you're on a page which talks about your mental health, and that information goes to the pixel, I mean, having a default for that becomes really tough, because let's say on an e-commerce website it's okay, but on a health app it's not okay. So I think the onus kind of lies more on businesses who have chosen to use the pixel, so they know there is a risk here. And then the second is making sure they're configuring it right. The onus is on the businesses more, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's a difficult one for me because I am, I'm not shy about criticizing big tech, as they say, but the problem is that these tools are just simply not to be used in some contexts, in some jurisdictions. And although there are problems with how a company like Google or Meta uses the data they receive, I don't think they are necessarily responsible for receiving that data. If it's proactively sent by a company in the wrong context, but at the same time, of course, I don't. I feel some sympathy with some of these companies that get caught up in this because it's so common. Marketing teams often don't think twice about this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And well, I'm just generally a sympathetic kind of person, so maybe they should be. Well, they definitely should be, but
I mean, I can we can like take an example from security, right? Like security, all the cloud providers have this shared model of security, right? That hey, we will secure everything, but there are configurations, and if you have an S3 bucket where you are storing credit card numbers, or social security numbers or health data, that should not be public. But we are providing you a way to store all that in S3, and there is by default it used to be public at some point of time. Now I think they are private by default or whatever. So they have this concept of shared responsibility model, right? All these cloud providers like AWS, Azure, GCP, all of them have that, where they take protection of the data center, but like how you configure, if there are some mistakes on that part, you can very well get breached, right? And companies are buying tools to just manage the posture on the cloud security of these tools, right? So I would say this is kind of similar in my view. And this is bigger than Meta, because Meta is not only the pixel that you'll have. You can have pixels from Snapchat, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok. You could have other SDKs, ad SDKs. Your cookie banner could be wrongly configured, right? So I think it's a problem more of how you're developing your products, and do you have the right quality checks or right privacy checks as part of the development life cycle. And obviously, I mean, like to your point, yeah, Meta can make it easier. They can probably have a DLP alerting people. They can monitor the traffic and say, hey, you're sending health data and you should not. But then they go into the argument that consciously they're going to check for certain things. So I mean, it's kind of a I mean, it's not that straightforward from the big tech companies' perspective, but like as a company who's processing health data, they need to be worried more than Meta to add a
Mm.
pixel on their website.
And as we'll see later in our discussion, this kind of broadening conception of what is health data, health information, I think will also take some companies by surprise. So let's cover
Yeah,
one more item before we come back to health privacy. The French Data Protection Authority, the CNIL, has come out with these details of its AI regulation action plan. So this is not the AI regulation that will come into effect in the EU, possibly quite soon. This is the Data Protection Authority acting under existing powers under the GDPR to regulate how people are developing and using AI. So French DPA is one of several EU regulators that have announced this focus on AI enforcement. And we also had this run in between OpenAI and the Italian regulator recently, which I'm
yeah,
sure people are aware of, the Chat GPT enforcement. Now, uh, OpenAI managed to satisfy the Italian regulator by putting in some new controls into Chat's GPT. And after they temporarily restricted access to their product in Italy, they've now been able to make it available again. But the French DPA, to my eyes, seems to be going a bit broader than the Italian one in
yeah.
its OpenAI investigation. They're looking at issues that didn't really come up with OpenAI security, for one. Um, so, what do you think, Vaibhav? Is this just the beginning of Europe's kind of approach to regulating AI? What can we expect for companies using these products or developing them?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was always going to be the AI law or the AI governance law, which was supposed to pass, right? I think what has happened with this Chat GPT, large language models, and I mean, it's going to be with the open source models picking up, and this I'm also seeing in other tech startups that are coming up, they are being used as, I mean, even more, right? So, I mean, what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of explosion of AI across companies and actual usage of AI because in a lot of cases, it's like earlier if you had to set up, let's say, a call center or if you had to like do SMS authentication, you had to do a lot of work. But at some point of time, Twilio came and offered an API, right? Hit an API, send an OTP, one-time password, and authenticate. And some parts of AI is becoming that, right? It's like, hey, hit an API to uh, OpenAI or Stability or Google Bard, so there will be like IBM, all these big companies, maybe Snowflake at some point will have like APIs which you will hit and then, get your work done, which means a lot of applications, and these are like normal companies, applications will start to have AI in it. So that will be an explosion. There will be an explosion on the business side, right? So you have ChatGPT doing some task, and then, like people are already using it to write content, but it will at some point of time become recursive, multi-step as well. So that will be another explosion where non engineers will be using AI a lot, right? And third, there will be companies who will be just building these models, right? So overall, I think uh, what the French regulator is moving towards is kind of looking at broader, building up an AI task force and looking at all the different aspects of it. And I think it's smart because I mean it's just exploding everywhere, right? So they need to look at, or as an industry, we need to figure out, what are the risks, what are the biases, uh, what does security mean in these models, what does privacy mean in these models. We've already touched upon, hey, what does right to be forgotten means in a open AI scenario, or a large language model scenario. Can you really delete the data once it's there in the model, or it will split it out, or when you really ask for it. So So yeah, I think what the French regulator is doing is kind of that, right? They do realize that this is exploding and is going to explode across business functions, across companies, and then so how do we have a framework which works across multiple things that could be of risk? You know, where the data is going to come from? Is it publicly generated data? And you know, the outputs and the inputs, etc.
Good. And I think that when the AI regulation or the AI Act does pass in the EU, companies that have paid attention to AI in the scope of the GDPR will already be in a good position to deal with that. I think, particularly the non-high risk models. There's a lot of assessment and so on that goes into high risk AI, but there's other transparency obligations and so on for the lower risk models, and I think a lot of that already is covered by the GDPR. And so, paying attention to these task forces that are coming out, the European Data Protection Board also has a Europe-wide or EU-wide task force. UK is taking a more liberal approach to AI regulation. But that's not true in the EU, so people really do need to be paying attention. I'll just mention this as well, and then we'll move on. The EU-US Data Privacy Framework, the next iteration of Privacy Shield, a bit of a bump in the road for this agreement, not a major one. The European Parliament has resolved not to support the Commission's adequacy decision that would kind of ratify, if you will, this deal between Washington and Brussels to try and solve this problem, however temporarily, of US-EU data transfers. So the Parliament is not in favour of this agreement. They are worried about the intelligence activities still, the right of redress for people who are illegally surveilled by the US government, and they just don't think it's going to hold at the Court of Justice, just like the last two. Now, the Parliament's not involved directly in the approval process, so I don't think that people hoping for this to pass will need to worry that much, or people hoping that it will fail should celebrate just yet. But it's an interesting little sort of bump for the deal. More detail in their newsletter if anyone wants to subscribe to that. Now, we'll move on to our main item, and we've covered a bit of this already. We're talking about pixels, SDKs, cookies, APIs, and health privacy. Now, we were going to talk only about the recent decision from the French Data Protection Authority again. They fined a company called Doctissimo 380,000 euros yesterday, split between GDPR and e-privacy violations. So they were basically offering health-related articles, quizzes, discussion forums, all health-related. And they appear to have made a lot of mistakes, GDPR-wise. Consent for cookies being one, storage limitation, not having a joint controller arrangement with their joint controllers, and it's all special category data in EU terms, so sensitive data about health. Now, there was also, I'm going to ask you about this as well, Vaibhav, the Federal Trade Commission in the US is on a bit of a rampage this year.
Yeah.
3 enforcement actions of some sort against health-related companies. The latest one is against something called Premom, or Premum, as it would be called over here, a company that does a kind of fertility ovulation app. And the FTC is proposing a pretty harsh order against this company for similar sorts of violations. So tell me, Vaibhav, Doctissimo and Premom, both of these companies seem to have been doing things that are not uncommon. We see a lot of companies with these SDKs in their apps without compliant cookie banners. Do you think that this is quite widespread? Do you think this enforcement action is just the tip of the iceberg, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to your point, it is pretty widespread. SDKs are, third-party packages are regularly added to mobile applications. It's a very, very common practice, even to websites. In fact, on the security side of the world, there is this whole open source security, category. You have to, there are bugs and vulnerabilities on that side. On the privacy side of the house, where we don't have that much visibility today, which we are trying to change, you have a lot of third parties SDKs inside mobile app, and they're there for multiple reasons. You could have them for advertising, for analytics, for tracking bugs, for sending emails, for payments, right? And yeah, I mean, typically what we see is like any mobile app could have anywhere from 30, 40 to even hundreds of SDKs inside their app, depending on the size, right? So it's a very pretty common practice. And on the other hand, the second thing, or if you look at across both the cases, is the definition of health data as we are talking is kind of evolving, right? Wherein uh, just the use of a website and basic identifiers like IP address, cookies, email which is tied to a service which is offering sensitive, health services, right? Or health services in general becomes health data. The forms, I mean, that's been a common thread across, I think, I don't know how many health apps, wherein there is a form which kind of is taking a quiz, trying to figure out what kind of service you need, or, which doctor you should be referred to, or things like those forms are typically the data of those forms are typically sent to analytics platforms like Google Analytics, because what you're trying to do is figure out, okay, where is my user dropping so that I can optimize the form, right? So the use case is pretty simple. And I mean, if I'm a product manager, which I was back in the day, I'm doing it on an e-commerce website, it makes sense. I'm trying to optimize my funnel for login. But when you do it on a health app, the you need to be more careful because sometimes that could leak health data, right? And the overall problem that we see across these two is it's pretty common because that's how companies operate. They build products fast, and the person who's building the product does not understand the privacy risk, which is same as security. The developers don't understand the security risk, and hence they are prompted to whenever they write code which has security issues, they're prompted to fix them. Similarly, we don't have that yet in all companies. That's what we're trying to change. As developers write code, they need to be prompted about these privacy issues, right? But if you take a step back, it's the same thing. Figure out the definition of health data is expanded. Um Health data sharing is under scrutiny, and there are a lot of exit points, be it SDKs, APIs, these pixels tags inside these applications and websites. And a combination of these two is leading to these fines, and that's not going to stop after my data gets passed. I mean, that's going to increase even more.
Mm. So that's really interesting actually to have a bit of insight into the product development side of this. How these things happen in the in the process of developing an app or a website. And you can, so on the regulatory front, so the FTC has brought this action under something called the Health Breach Notification Rule. Now,
Yep.
this is a pretty normal looking data breach law that says companies need to notify consumers and sometimes the media if there's a security incident that results in unauthorized access to data. Now, in 2021, I think it was, the FTC put out a policy statement about this law, and they said included in the definition of a security incident is the sharing of data with any third party. And
Yeah.
health information, by the way, could be an IP address, for example, if it's associated with someone using a health app. Because if I mean, this is the FTC's position, if there's for example, a mobile ID is a better example, or an advertising ID. If my
Yeah.
advertising ID is associated with an app about a specific health condition, and you're sending that ID to Facebook, then Facebook knows, ostensibly that I've got that health condition. So I think people need to be thinking much more broadly about what constitutes a data breach, and B, health information. And really,
Yeah.
once you know those two facts, then you need to get down to work figuring out what your product does. What, because you
Yeah.
mentioned something like, how many SDKs did you say end up in most apps?
Yeah, I mean,
There was a
I would say
figure.
like yeah. I mean, I don't have like a survey or like a cross apps, but like what I've at least seen anywhere from at least 20, 30 SDKs to
Yeah,
sometimes even like
yeah.
it could go up 50,
I
60,
would have
100
said
as well. Yeah.
I would have guessed sort of high teens, 20, but that's a lot of third parties, and part of the problem is that the data can often be then further shared by those third parties. So you can see why the privacy environment in the US, especially, they're newly concerned about this. In the EU, of course, this has always been
Yeah.
explicitly required. And I think also, so if we look at what happened to this Premom company, the FTC wants to stop them from using health information for advertising permanently.
Yeah.
Now, they didn't, it wasn't illegal to do that with consent, because the mistake they made was not realizing, I think, that they were doing it, to be honest, because they said in their privacy policy and so on, like many companies do, we don't share health information, we don't sell personal data, etc. But because the landscape is changing, they actually ended up doing that and breaking those promises. So, I mean, what do you think? Is there a basis perhaps for, if you've got better visibility over what you're doing, you can then ask for consent where appropriate,
Yeah.
and you know,
I think that's the problem. I don't think so. I mean, from a perspective of FTC, they are against, I mean, they are going after companies if you are sharing health data. I mean, that's not what they're concerned. I mean, they're concerned about that, but the main thing that they are going after is you are saying in your privacy policy as a promise to users, you will never sell the data or you will never share health data with any third party, right?
mm,
Except for maybe analytics purpose. And here is a list of SDKs which are using it for advertising. Here is a list of SDK which is going out for US. And this is, you took the such sensitive data from a consumer on the promise of not sharing it. That's the promise you made, but the reality is completely different. So if the promises match their code reality, what's happening inside the mobile app, there would be no issue from an FTC point of view, right?
mhm,
Obviously, from a My Health, My Data, or from a European perspective, you need consent, right? Because special category data, or things of that nature, or even putting pixels. So that's a different thing. But purely from FTC, I think it's just a mismatch between what you're saying to your users and what's happening inside your product, right? So you're making
yeah,
one promise to get them to use the product, but and the thing is, it might not happen at the start. When someone wrote a privacy policy, that might be the reality. They might not be sharing any health data. But what happens is over time, drift happens. You add new third parties, nobody tells the privacy person on the team, and the privacy policy remains something which is outdated. You start to share more data, and situations like these happen. I mean, I honestly feel that's the same situation with cookie banners as well, wherein you start with the place of compliance, and then some configuration changes, and then your cookies start to drop and the banner doesn't work. So it's just a problem of how change management is integrated from a
mm.
privacy standpoint.
That's really interesting. So there's change in the in the US, at least. There has been a change in regulatory attitude, I think, since Lena Khan
Yeah.
came into the commission, and also the products change over time. You get a new marketing person, and they got a different idea. You get a new head of operations or whatever, and they want to do this or that with the products, and people lose track of what's going on, and the visibility gets cloudy. Good. Okay. Well, there's so much to talk about with this case. Also, we don't have time to cover it all, unfortunately. You mentioned the kind of promises made in a privacy policy uh, being kept.
Yeah.
The FTC seems to focus on that because of the FTC Act, of course, which is essentially a consumer protection law. But you can see they're very, very keen on penalising privacy, particularly in the area of health. So they're using these very old legal instruments in quite a modern sort of way. I do wonder about how the courts will see it, but that's not going to come up for a long time. The fact is
Yeah.
that this is
Uh,
happening.
yeah, I mean, well, like if you look at My Health, My Data Act, that is actually like legitimizing what the
Yeah,
FTC is finding, right?
yeah,
It
hmm
it actually goes even one step ahead because it actually defines this is what a consumer health data is, and it's.
hmm
I was looking at the list that they have inside the law itself. It's pretty exhaustive, right? It's going to be such a large amount of data that will come under it from a health perspective, which was never there. So it's going to be, I mean, all the health apps there, it's going to be a complete change. And they really talk about when who you can share the data with, when you need consent, when you like selling data is very specific, you need specific things. So I would say like, I mean, it's already legitimized, it'll go live next year. So after that, it's like that law itself will take care of it. But yeah, it's
yeah,
exactly in that direction.
definitely. And a lot of the state laws as well, of course, beyond My Health, My Data, have implications
Yeah.
for non-health companies, for companies in the kind of grey area that do a bit of health stuff. It's changing very fast. So let's have a final thought then, Vaibhav. I mean, you've covered a lot of this, but what do you think? Let's say I run a website or app that processes health information, or that I think might process health information. What's the first step for me to make sure I don't fall into this trap that many other health companies seem to be falling into?
I think the best part to or the best place to start is on two things, right? I mean, one is what data you have. That's the first part, what all is health data, which forms you have. So look at the collection point and all health data you have. And then second, exit points. And those exit points, at least on the front end, starts with the website and the mobile app. What all third parties are there, either via an SDK or via an API. Having that inventory of all the third parties on your front end app and website and the data, that's the first point. That's like basic, you need that. And then the next advanced stage is you find flows. Okay, where is this data flowing? If we have Google Analytics, what all Google Analytics can capture from the website or from the mobile app. And the final stage would be where you're monitoring it as it changes before it goes live. There is some privacy check, which is ensuring it's not going live. It's actually preventing this accidental data sharing of health data, or someone might be knowingly sharing it. But I would say like basic start with just inventorying the data and the exit points, any third party SDK, any third party APIs.
Good. So understand what data you're collecting, what sort of data it is, and where it's going. And on a technical level, that 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 can be done, I think, these days without too much difficulty. It's just a case of really figuring out your posture in relation to these laws, and also, laws aside, your customers, your users, their
Yeah.
trust in your company. I don't talk up enforcement that much, but in the FTC's case, I mean, they really are going for it at the moment, and
Yeah.
it's very interesting to watch from across the pond. So thanks so much, Vaibhav. Really interesting chat as always. Just to mention again that this was brought to you by Privado AI, a developer-friendly privacy platform that helps enterprises bridge the privacy engineering gap. Privacy code scanning is their thing. It helps you get better visibility over what data your products are collecting and how they're using and sharing it. We'll be back next week, and do subscribe to the newsletter. That's a great place for me to put down some of my thoughts about privacy, data protection across the world. And we'll see you next week. It's the GDPR's birthday coming up. So hope to see you then.
Thanks, everyone.